Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really diving deep into Michel de Montaigne,
Oh, yeah.
a 16th century French philosopher.
Hmm.
And, his essays, they continue to just fascinate philosophers, even now.
For sure.
You, dear listener, are one such philosopher. We've got excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy
Okay.
and, of course, the essays themselves.
Of course.
So are you ready to kind of uncover why Montaigne still matters centuries later?
Absolutely. I think he's often seen as like a bridge between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment,
Yeah.
a figure whose skepticism and emphasis on personal experience really laid the groundwork for how we think, even today.
Okay, so let's unpack this, starting with the man himself. His upbringing was fascinating. I mean, imagine being raised in a 16th century French castle,
Right.
speaking only Latin.
It's true, yeah. His father was a forward-thinking, maybe a little eccentric nobleman, but he wanted to immerse his son in classical culture, like right from infancy.
So it was like a real-life linguistic experiment.
Exactly. And this unusual education, it instilled in Montaigne a deep appreciation for ancient literature and philosophy, and it probably contributed to his later skepticism towards tradition, right? Like not just accepting things because they've always been done that way.
Speaking of formative experiences, his close friendship with Etienne de la Boétie must have been hugely influential.
Oh, absolutely. La Boétie was a brilliant humanist, scholar, and political thinker. And his death, he died pretty young, really affected Montaigne. And it prompted him to, withdraw to his estate and kind of embark on this journey of self-reflection.
It's interesting that he chose this path. I mean, after all, with his background, he could have easily pursued a more conventional career, like in politics or law.
Yeah, and that's what's so fascinating is that he didn't reject public life entirely. He served as the mayor of Bordeaux and had to navigate all the complexities of the French wars of religion. But he always maintained a critical distance, like he was observing human behavior with this keen eye.
And that's where the essays come in, right? It's not your typical philosophical treatise.
No, not at all. It's really more a collection of musings and observations and introspections on like a huge range of topics. You'll find him reflecting on, I don't know, death and friendship, cannibalism and education, all with this really engaging mix of wit and erudition.
And here's something that makes the essays truly unique. He kept revising and adding to them throughout his life.
Oh, yeah.
Modern editions actually show you those layers of revision, which I think adds another dimension to the reading experience.
It really does. It's like we're witnessing his thought process, watching
Wow.
his ideas evolve over time. It also highlights how open-ended his writing is. There's no grand system, no attempt to, like present this unified philosophical doctrine.
It sounds like he was more interested in posing questions than providing answers.
Yeah.
That's certainly appealing to a philosopher like our listener.
Precisely. And this questioning spirit, it's evident in his critique of traditional philosophy. Montaigne challenged the scholastic methods of his time, which really relied heavily on rote learning and the authority of figures like Aristotle.
So he wasn't afraid to go against the grain. Was that because of his early exposure to diverse perspectives, through his upbringing?
It's certainly possible. I mean, growing up immersed in classical literature, like that might have given him a broader outlook and a more critical stance towards the intellectual trends of his time.
It's almost as if he was saying, let's not just blindly accept what's been said before. Let's think for ourselves. Let's question our assumptions. Let's use our own judgment.
That's a great way to put it. He really championed this idea of free judgment, emphasizing the importance of personal experience and critical reflection in, the pursuit of knowledge. He wasn't interested in abstract theorizing just for the sake of it. He wanted to connect those philosophical ideas to lived experience, to the challenges of being human.
He was a philosopher of everyday life then.
Exactly. And this leads us to one of Montaigne's most famous concepts, his skepticism. His motto, Que sais-je, which means, what do I know? It perfectly captures his approach to knowledge.
So was he saying we can't know anything for sure? Was he a complete skeptic?
It's more nuanced than that. His skepticism, it was heavily influenced by ancient Pyrrhonism, and it wasn't about denying the possibility of knowledge. It was about acknowledging the limits of what we can understand as humans.
Yeah.
He saw how easily our judgments are swayed by our own biases, cultural conditioning.
So instead of clinging to these rigid beliefs, he was encouraging us to approach the world with an open mind, a willingness to question, to revise our opinions.
Precisely. And this intellectual humility is one of the reasons why Montaigne continues to resonate with philosophers even today. He reminds us that knowledge is a journey, not a destination, a process of constant exploration and self-reflection.
And he wasn't afraid to explore some pretty controversial topics along the way, right?
Yeah.
Especially his ideas about custom and culture.
Absolutely. Montaigne was fascinated by the diversity of human cultures. He observed how what's considered normal or taboo varies drastically from one society to another.
So he was essentially saying what's considered right or wrong, moral or immoral, often depends on where and when you live. Does this mean he was a cultural relativist?
That's a question that scholars still debate. While he clearly recognized the influence of custom in shaping our beliefs and values, I don't think he fully embraced the idea that all moral judgments are relative.
So he was walking this fine line, acknowledging these differences, but upholding some notion of universal values.
That's a really insightful observation. He believed we can use our judgment to evaluate customs and make moral distinctions, even while acknowledging that our own perspectives are shaped by our cultural background.
This is getting really interesting. We're starting to see how complex Montaigne's thought really is.
Yeah.
His skepticism, his emphasis on lived experience, his fascination with the diversity of human culture.
Yeah, and this complexity, this is what makes him so relevant, even today. He challenges us to think critically about the nature of knowledge, the role of culture in shaping our values, the very idea of what it means to be human.
Speaking of being human, didn't Montaigne also challenge that kind of prevailing anthropocentrism of his time?
He did. He questioned this assumption that humans are superior to animals. And he pointed out that we often overestimate our own importance in the grand scheme of things.
I see. So instead of seeing like a strict hierarchy with humans at the top, he saw more of a continuum.
Exactly. He argued that animals, they often display remarkable intelligence, even moral qualities that rival or even surpass those of humans. He even suggested that some animal societies, they might be structured in ways that are more just and harmonious than our own.
Fascinating. So he was really pushing those boundaries of philosophical thought, right?
Sure.
Questioning those assumptions that most people in his time just took for granted.
Absolutely. And his willingness to delve into those uncomfortable truths, to explore the darker sides of human nature alongside its virtues. That's something that I think continues to intrigue us.
It makes me wonder what a philosopher like Montaigne, what he would have to say about modern philosophy. If he could time travel to the 21st century, what would he make of our current philosophical landscape?
That's a great question. Given his skepticism of grand systems and his emphasis on individual experience, I imagine he might be, somewhat critical of certain trends in contemporary thought.
Like what specifically?
Well, he might question the tendency to prioritize abstract theorizing over lived experience, or to become overly specialized in narrow subfields of philosophy.
So he wouldn't be impressed with a 500-page treatise on the metaphysics of modality.
He might appreciate the intellectual rigor, but I suspect he would also urge the author to get out of the ivory tower and see how those abstract concepts actually play out, in the messy reality of everyday life. Remember, Montaigne, he believed that philosophy should be a tool for living, not just an intellectual exercise.
He'd probably tell them to go for a walk in the woods and observe the ants or something.
Exactly. He'd remind us that wisdom can be found not just in books, but also in the world around us. Yeah. In our interactions with others, and in the quiet moments of self-reflection.
This reminds me of something we touched upon earlier, Montaigne's lasting influence on later philosophers. His ideas didn't just fade away after he died. They kind of rippled through intellectual history and really shaped the course of Western thought.
Absolutely. His impact on figures like Francis Bacon, René Descartes, and even Thomas Hobbes, it's undeniable. They may have reached different conclusions, but they were all grappling with questions that Montaigne had raised.
So how did Montaigne shape the course of Western thought? What were some of his key contributions?
Well, for starters, Francis Bacon, who really championed the scientific method and the idea of inductive reasoning. He was clearly influenced by Montaigne's emphasis on observation and experience. He even adopted the essay form from Montaigne, recognizing its power to explore ideas in a flexible and open-ended way.
So both men were kind of reacting against that rigidity of scholasticism, advocating for a more empirical and exploratory approach to knowledge.
Exactly. And then you have Descartes, often hailed as the father of modern philosophy. While he's best known for his method of radical doubt and that famous declaration, I think, therefore I am, we can see echoes of Montaigne's skepticism in his work.
It's almost as if Descartes took Montaigne's "what do I know?" and turned it into like a systematic method for, stripping away all assumptions and rebuilding knowledge from the ground up.
That's a brilliant insight. And even Thomas Hobbes, a thinker often seen as like completely opposed to Montaigne, he was engaged in a dialogue with Montaigne's ideas.
Wade Hobbes, the philosopher who argued for a strong sovereign to keep our selfish instincts in check. He seems like the antithesis of Montaigne, who celebrated individual freedom and self-expression.
That's true on the surface. But both Hobbes and Montaigne recognized those complexities of human nature. They both saw that we're capable of great things, but also prone to, selfishness, violence, and irrationality.
So even though they reached different conclusions about, the role of government, the nature of society, they shared a common understanding of that human condition as inherently flawed and conflicted.
Exactly. They were both wrestling with these questions that Montaigne had brought to the forefront of, philosophical debate. And this wrestling continues even today. Montaigne's work remains a vital resource for anyone seeking to understand the human condition in all its messy and magnificent complexity.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that a philosopher writing in the 16th century could still be so relevant to us today. I mean, it really speaks to the enduring power of his ideas.
It does, and I think part of that appeal, it lies in his ability to just connect with us on a human level. He doesn't just, present abstract arguments. He shares his own doubts, his struggles, his joys, and he does it with this candor that's both refreshing and disarming.
Yeah, he invites us to join him on his journey of self-discovery, doesn't he? And by
Right.
doing that, he encourages us to embark on our own kind of journeys of philosophical exploration.
Precisely. He shows us that philosophy, it isn't just this academic discipline, it's a way of life, a way of engaging with the world and with ourselves, with curiosity, open-mindedness, and a healthy dose of skepticism.
And perhaps most importantly, he reminds us to do it all with a sense of joy and humor. His writing is full of wit and playfulness, even when he's tackling those serious subjects.
Absolutely. He demonstrates that intellectual rigor, it doesn't have to be dry or somber. It can be infused with this love of life and a genuine appreciation for just the beauty and strangeness of being human.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Montaigne, I'm left with this kind of tantalizing question. If he were alive today, what would he be writing about? What customs and beliefs would he be scrutinizing with his sharp wit and insightful mind?
Hmm. That's a fascinating thought experiment. Given his fascination with cultural differences, I imagine he would be so deeply engaged just exploring the complexities of our globalized world. I mean, he would be dissecting those ways that cultures clash and blend in the 21st century, analyzing the impact of technology on human interaction, the rise of new social norms.
And with his kind of penchant for self-reflection, I can picture him writing like a series of essays on the challenges of navigating the digital age. He might even pen an essay titled, On the Art of Tweeting with Wisdom,
Mm.
or maybe Of Selfies in the Search for Identity.
Now, those are essays I would love to read. He'd likely have some pretty pointed observations about our obsession with social media, this constant barrage of information, the lines between public and private life, how they're so blurred now.
And knowing Montaigne, he'd do it all with a twinkle in his eye, blending those profound insights with those witty observations that leave us both laughing and pondering the deeper implications.
Yeah, he'd remind us, even in this fast-paced, technology-driven world, that the most important journey is the one we take inward, the journey of self-discovery and understanding.
So, dear listener, we leave you with this image. Montaigne, in a cozy armchair, maybe with a laptop instead of, a quill and parchment, still grappling with those timeless questions of human existence, still challenging us to think critically and to live fully, still reminding us that the unexamined life is not worth living.
And that even in the face of uncertainty and change, we can find joy in the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom.
Because ultimately, as Montaigne himself taught us, the greatest adventure is the adventure of being human.